Cross-medium adaptations are an interesting phenomenon. They force creators to dissect media that's been divorced from its intended presentation, or original presentation, and then to re-present that media whilst keeping its spirit intact. If Star Wars were a living brain, then cross-medium adaptations could be considered to be body transplants, with each new form presenting the old formula with some unique flair. This helps it reach new markets, but it also comes at a cost because every adaptation makes defining the franchise's true identity a bit harder. After all, the medium is often as much the message as the actual story. There have been countless attempts to recapture the essence of Star Wars by authors, artists, fans, movie makers, etc. But the medium which seems to have the greatest difficulty with this is video games. EA's Battlefront sure looks and sounds like Star Wars, but nothing about having the thing in one's hands invokes the mystical space opera of the original movies. Everyone loves to harp on about how Jedi Academy had great lightsaber combat, but there's more to Star Wars than spinny lightsabers. For my money, it wasn't until Bioware was given a crack at the license that we saw an approach which managed to encapsulate the entirety of the Star Wars franchise in interactive form, and in this video, we'll be looking at what they created. KotOR released on PCs and the original Xbox back in July 2003. To say this was a transformative period for video games would be an understatement. Morrowind had just a year earlier brought the PC role-playing game to consoles. California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger was soon about to sign the inhibitory bill which would get the ball rolling on the American Supreme Court guaranteeing video games free speech protection. Steam was just a few months away from revolutionizing the PC gaming experience, and Lucasarts was going through its final golden age. Lucasarts, to the uninitiated, is of course the video game studio founded by Star Wars creator George Lucas, which had made its name making some of the 90s most innovative and beloved point-and-click adventure titles. Amazingly, George Lucas was very hands-off in regards to the direction of this studio, and this gave Lucasarts employees the freedom to experiment in ways other studios simply could not do. The studio's final golden age coincided with the launch of the prequel series of films. Not exactly beloved by fans, but undoubtedly it reignited LucasArts' dedication towards exploring Star Wars in different ways. During the 90s, we saw Star Wars TIE Fighter take the dogfighting from the films and present it with the grit and involvement of that era's flight simulators, bridging the gap between the fantasy world of Star Wars and our more mundane world. Dark Forces took the Doom formula and expanded and refitted it to fit the Star Wars aesthetic. Super Star Wars took the run-and-gun platforming of the Mega Mans and did you-know-what. A problem with a lot of these older games, however, is that their approaches, while interesting, tended to make the Star Wars license the secondary feature. The aforementioned games were all very much reskin jobs, where a game of an already established genre was made to look and sound like Star Wars. A lot of the mid-2000s titles did this as well. The FPS Star Wars was Battlefront 2, if you're a cool guy. The kiddie adventure game was LEGO Star Wars, and the MMORPG was Star Wars Galaxies. This is why KotOR is such an interesting game. Its video game lineage can be traced to Neverwinter Nights and the Baldur's Gates, and those games both have their origins in tabletop role-playing games, specifically Dungeons & Dragons. Let's back up a bit. In 1999, LucasArts had started thinking about partnering with Bioware on a project based on Bioware's history with well-executed role-playing games. And LucasArts had, by the way, originally conceived of the game as a Baldur's Gate-esque affair. A 2D top-down perspective, an involved role-playing game HUD, the works. But Bioware reasoned that without the cinematic quality offered by 3 Dimensions, the game could never fully invoke Star Wars because so much of its fantasy is getting lost in the used universe and the sweeping vistas. This insight altered the direction of the game, and it reveals arguably the biggest strength BioWare had going for them. They were willing to think outside the box and go the extra mile to pursue presentation authenticity. It wasn't a question of just reskinning a popular game with the Star Wars world, but rather picking the correct game for the license. This led them to making the Infinity engine by updating the Aurora engine, which they used to run Neverwinter Nights and would later be used to run the original Witcher. Fun fact. What these games have in common is that they are focused on narrative and world building, and their mechanics naturally lend themselves to immersive play sessions. Star Wars is surprisingly faithful to the conventional fantasy setting. The tropes and archetypes are reskinned for a used universe aesthetic, but there's not much one needs to change to adapt a straight-up D&D inspired role-playing game into a Star Wars game. I'll be going over the game's mechanics and why this kind of game engine was the proper approach to take in order to bring Star Wars to the interactive medium proper later on, but for now, I feel like the game's place in history has been well established enough for us to start digging into the game itself. You can tell a lot about what developers think their games are about by looking at the way they introduce them. When we open up KotOR, the first thing we see that's worth noting is the game's menu. In the background, we hear one of the game's numerous Sith themes. The one which features some sampling of the Emperor's theme from Return of the Jedi. The Emperor is the franchise's darkest character and one of cinema's most famous villains, so hearing this theme when we start up the game is very noteworthy because we also see Darth Malak, the game's bad guy, in the menu. This opening primer is very dark, but it's not the extent of it, because we also have the character creation. This is where we allocate our stats, and the team at Bioware used this opportunity to give us some lore. Many RPGs do this, but it's still nice to see. The typical RPG classes are like a warrior, mage, and thief or archer or something, but here we have a scoundrel, scout, and soldier. Those are very Star Wars-y classes, and if the opening menu introduced us to the game's emotion, then the character creation introduces us to the game's devotion to its license. After finalizing our character, we start the game, and bam! The Star Wars crawl. A major reason this crawl was originally included in the first Star Wars movie was to give the audience a sense of entering an ongoing adventure, and it accomplishes that same goal here as we learn about the Republic and how it's not doing so hot because Darth Malak, Darth Revan's only surviving student, is waging a deadly war against them. We also learn about the Jedi Order, which Malak has left scattered and vulnerable, and we learn how many within their ranks are swearing their allegiances to Malak. Finally, we learn about the Outer Rim and the planet Terrace, above which a Jedi battle fleet is under attack. Then, we see ourselves. We're aboard the vessel, and it's time for our amnesiac self to learn the basics of interacting with the world. This is framed as an escape mission, and it goes over how to use the equip screen, how the party system works, how the journal works, how to interact with terminals, how combat works, and it also has some key narrative points sprinkled throughout, like when we come across a Dark Jedi, actually a Sith, and Jedi fighting, and like how Bastila Shan's name is being repeated over and over again. The first big mission in the game post-tutorial is to find her, so signaling her importance this heavily this early on is a nice touch. We end the tutorial by meeting up with our first full game party member KotOR and escaping on an escape pod to Terrace, where we are next shown to wake up from a strange dream with ominous implications down the track. This opening is loud and action-packed and very much in line with how the world was first introduced to Star Wars. The first movie opens in a very similar manner, with the scrappy underdog spaceship being attacked by the big bad spaceship. This game is not a carbon copy of any Star Wars movie, but it does touch on some familiar notes from time to time. According to numerous interviews I read in preparation for this video, BioWare's central goal throughout KotOR's production was to make a definitive precursor to the Star Wars expanded universe. They wanted to stay true to the spirit of the Star Wars fans loved, whilst also making something that felt very much like its own thing. Since that was their goal, it's only fair that the following serve as our analytical lens going forwards. How does a given implementation evoke Star Wars whilst making KotOR feel unique? Since we've gone over the game's opening, let's apply the lens. How did it evoke Star Wars whilst feeling unique? Well, like I mentioned, this opening on a surface level mirrors the opening to the first movie. We start the scene from the soldier's perspective as the bad guys board the ship, and we end the scene with an escape pod being launched. The biggest difference is that we never change perspective. We follow one character as he makes his way through the scene. At points we can play the other party member, but the focus is on our protagonist, and side note, I refer to our protagonist as a male and will continue to do so as that's what canon dictates. Also, and this is just a personal opinion, I feel like the canonical genders of KotOR 1 and 2 make much more sense than the alternative genders offered. Something about the relationships between the characters makes more sense when we play through KotOR as a man and KotOR 2 as a woman. Anyway, back on subject. The opening to the original Star Wars is a very good way to hook an audience and sneak in some exposition to get them up to speed with the world. KotOR's world is different enough from the one seen in A New Hope for the same opening to feel different. They use the same-ish events and framing to reach the same ends introduction, but what they are introducing, their respective worlds and issues, that's the stuff that's different. Much like in A New Hope, KotOR's introduction ends with the escape pod landing on a nearby planet and the story's pace slowing down for a while. On Terrace, we first encounter KotOR's planet story structure, but before diving into that stuff, I'm going to broadly go over the game's story for the uninitiated. KotOR is set roughly 4,000 years before the movies. Before the events of the game, Revan and Malak, both former Jedi turned Dark Lords of the Sith, unleashed a Sith armada against the Republic. Malak later betrayed his master Revan and took the mantle of Sith Lord for himself. There's a lot of questioning of loyalties amongst Jedi during this time, and it's not too long after that the game's opening took place. After crashing on Terrace, our unconscious player character was pulled away from the wreckage by Karth. Before awakening, we saw a dream of a dark Jedi, Sith, fighting Bastila. And eventually we found ourselves in the game's first slow section. In the apartment where we wake up, Karth explains the situation on Terrace. Darth Malak has initiated martial law because he's searching for Bastila. Unable to leave, we must get to Bastila before Malak can, and in the quest to do so we meet a Twi'lek girl named Mission Vao and her Wookiee friend Zalbar. Also, we're joined by this astromech droid T3M4 and this Mandalorian mercenary Kandor Zordo before leaving the planet. But since he's getting nowhere with his search, Malak decides that it's time to get serious. This is where the story's stakes are raised as Malak decrees that Terrace in its entirety is to be destroyed. Whoops, I meant. Yeah, it's not as graceful, but that's rather the point, isn't it? Malak's cool scene aside, we had already departed for Dantooine, and when we get there, our previously discovered force capabilities, which I didn't mention, my bad, are expanded upon as we are trained in the Jedi ways. It's also around this point in the story that we're introduced to the star maps and the Star Forge. The former being the main objective for most of the game, and the latter being the ultimate Sith weapon, which Malak and Revan discovered. The star maps are spread across the galaxy, which gives us reason to visit the game's numerous planets. We want to find them all to piece out the Starforge's location, which we eventually do after gaining some more allies and uncovering some twists. The Starforge is the final level, and we can pick one of two endings to wrap up the story. If we want to be the bad guy, we can kill Malak and usurp his throne. But if we want to be a cool guy, then we can take out Malak and the Starforge, and then watch this here cutscene which wraps up loose ends and closes the experience. That's the most mechanical and detached way to transcribe the events of the game, so I understand if any one of you who haven't played it might think it's lacking, But as we go over the game in finer detail, I assure you, you will understand why it is so good. KotOR plays not much more complex than what you've seen on screen so far, but it's the application and structure which makes it so good. The game is bookended by two fairly linear action set pieces, but the meat of the experience, what we spend most of our time in KotOR doing, is engaging with the various inhabitants of the game's worlds. There are 8 main planets in this game: Terrace, Dantooine, Tatooine, Kashyyyk, Manaan, Korriban, Lehon, and Yavin 4. There's also the Ender Spire, the Leviathan, and the Starforge, but these are not planets and they play very differently from the standard levels. The planet's main objective will tend to be finding a star map. I say tend to be because Lehon does not have a star map, and because I never advanced whatever quest there is on Yavin 4, so I don't really know what's going on there. In terms of driving player behavior, the star maps act as simple, elegant compasses that we can rely on to keep our heading in the game. If we ever get lost in a given level, we just need to ask ourselves where the nearest star map might be. I took special care just now to refer to the star maps as the planet's main objectives, and I did that because KotOR has a lot of optional content. And I'm pleased to say that these side quests are pretty well implemented, all things considered, since they most often support the game's larger goal of invoking Star Wars. This isn't the case of sending the player out to fetch a bucket for the sake of padding playtime. KotOR is pretty far removed from the D&D origins of its ancestors, but it still contains one of their largest downgrades from actual D&D. In Dungeons and Dragons, or any similar tabletop role-playing game, everything can be explored and given purpose because there's a dungeon master overseeing that the player's interaction with the game world can be consequential, or at the very least doesn't break the game world's believability. In a video game, you can load and reload to your desires until RNG rolls in your favor, but in D&D, actions tend to have some repercussions. Your mileage may of course vary. When, in the 90s, D&D was transformed into a single-player experience, developers were able to create fantastic adventures we could explore with the tried-and-true role-playing mechanics, and they were also able to write more personally involved stories since they didn't have to worry about a pleasurable social experience. Unlike with the group setting of Dungeons and Dragons, computer role-playing games could actually tell stories about a main character who could have a role to play in the larger world. Something, of course, possible in D&D, but not very liked because it places clear favor on one player over the others. A nigh undebatable net loss in transforming the tabletop RPG into a single-player video game was losing the Dungeon Master. The worlds and quests could not be as flexible because the engines running the games are not as creative nor narratively in-tuned as a good Dungeon Master, and game engines are unlikely to reach that point anytime soon. For shame. For side quests, this means concentration of resources. Since they can't be made up on the spot, people had to actually script them out, which takes time, which meant they had to serve an actual purpose. And their purpose, as I can see it, is at least threefold. 1, they introduce players to the inhabitants of the world, which 2, reinforces the world as a realized, believable, lived-in place, and finally, 3, they allow players to modulate their experience. All 3 of these purposes are pretty self-explanatory, but I want to expand a bit more on number 3. One of the greatest advantages games can have over other media is the player's ability to alter the pace of narrative to fit their moods. Developers still have to take great care to pace a story correctly, but side quests and extendable main quests, for that matter, give the player the ability to naturally engage with the perfect version of the game for them, both in terms of the game's length and depth. If players don't want to spend a lot of time hanging out with these uncool Jedi on Tatooine, They can cut the fat and do the bare essentials, giving them more time to invest into hanging out with these rad Sith, cool cats that they are.
What do you know of the ways of the Sith?
In a very real sense, the depth of a given area is largely in the hands of the player. If you are so inclined, you can dig deeper than you have to and learn about the politics, rules, norms, lore, etc. more than is necessary. The only real trade-off, if you'd even call it that, is locations having to be more thoroughly fleshed out. This brings us into the quality versus quantity argument, since to fully realize the planets means reducing the overall number of planets the game can contain and still meet deadlines, but like it often does, quality in this case beats quantity. There's another dimension to Bioware affording the player some manner of control over the structure of the game's experience, and it's in our ability to choose the order in which we want to visit the planets. This gets utilized more during subsequent playthroughs, where we have become knowledgeable enough to assemble our favorite party and acquire our favorite equipment early on. Something I felt was sorely lacking in KotOR was a sense of carryover consequences. Each planet acts mostly as its own isolated experience, unconnected from the events we engage in on the other worlds. It's easy to see why that makes designing the story a lot easier, since there's rarely moments where the developers would have strung themselves up in continuity, but I'd still be interested in seeing some systems in the game take note of our experience and legacy within the game and deal out some fitting consequences. When we are on a given planet, the core gameplay has us gathering information, getting through obstacles, and communicating. This is vague enough of a gameplay loop to live or die off of the quality of the game moment to moment, and Bioware's commitment to evoking Star Wars is what I think makes the experience come together, even though the separated parts of gameplay might not be all that great. The information we gather is the functions of the organizations and the beliefs of the people. This game actually gave me some Morrowind flashbacks, where characters were often little more than glamorized Wikia articles, but that's a good thing. It looks, and might sound clunky now that I'm describing it, but when the game is in your hands, the dialogue can be very satisfying. The way the game handles combat is what new players will tend to have a gripe about, and I can't exactly blame them. One of KotOR's more archaic features is this party-based real-time with pause tactical combat system. This kind of combat system is actually an adaptation of how D&D handles combat, with players making turn-by-turn choices, only since there's no need to go over datasheets or lists of spells, the entire process can proceed a lot faster and can occur much more often over a given adventure. This system is actually very pleasant to engage with in a game like Pillars of Eternity, where the top-down presentation abstracts the combat enough to keep it intense, but KotOR's camera is plopped so close to the action that it's hard for it not to come across as artificial. Couple that with how lightsabers don't slice off limbs and how blaster bolts can be tanked, and we have a system that's less than optimal. It's by no means a mess, and it can certainly make for some tense moments, but I'd be lying if I said I didn't need to learn to love this system, and even then I just kinda like it. A slight change to combat which could work functionally the same in the player's hands would be if, instead of dealing health damage, characters lose something called, like, battle focus or something, when they would have lost health. That way we can have them not visually dealing any lethal blows until a character's health depletes completely, and it would actually make the whole process of mid-fight syringe injections make some sense. It's not health in a can, but something to relax the nerves. What I will say about the combat system though is that it is very in keeping with Star Wars, as we know it, that long-distance fighters can't hit to save their lives. The morality system in KotOR is a more questionable implementation than anything we've discussed so far, I think. When you do good, you gain light side points, and when you do bad, you get dark side points. I don't think this is a failure in any spectacular spectacular regard, but I do think it's inconsistent with the story's own conceptualization of morality. We'll get more into this when we discuss our protagonist, but for now, let's just say that the game puts the Jedi dogma through the ringer. In all the interviews I went through and in all of the wikias I read, the one question I never found a concrete response to was, what is Star Wars to Bioware? Having gone over the fundamentals of gameplay, I think it's fair to say that Star Wars to Bioware is action and character drama. And the game Bioware designed was flexible enough to express numerous Star Wars-y moments. There's the sneaking around an enemy base, brave gun battles, there are numerous meditative moments, and they even bothered to emulate the dogfighting. It might be the least involved challenge in the entire game, which is saying something considering this game has swoop racing, but, I mean, it's there. BioWare's pursuit of a game that could accurately express Star Wars is why this works. It's not necessarily any more admirable than their previous works on a gameplay gradient, but it is very clever in that it places the burden of ensuring a quality experience mainly on the writing. It's not so much that these systems invoke Star Wars, but rather, these systems let us move through numerous and varied gauntlets which all do. And in that sense, BioWare did a fantastic job of designing a game capable of presenting this world in an engaging way. Which means the next logical question to ask is, what is this world? KotOR's world is Star Wars, but not quite. Not yet. Remember when Malik destroyed Taris and it looked like this? And not this? I said this wasn't graceful, and it really isn't. KotOR excludes fancy superweapons. The Starforge is a tool, and it was found, not made. Revan didn't even fully understand its capabilities or true nature. Allow me to posit that KotOR's world is the grittier Star Wars, the more Churchill-Roosevelt kind of Star Wars. KotOR takes place when the galaxy is less tamed and the rules which governed canonically subsequent works are still being established. The opening crawl was designed to give the audience a sense of entering an ongoing adventure, and that's the impression one gets when engaging with the characters in any given world. Finding the star maps isn't even that special because Revan and Malik already did that. This was during the Mandalorian War, which nearly brought the Republic to its knees. Had it not been for the late-game arrival of Revan and Malik, events would surely have turned out differently. The Mandalorians we see in the game are pretty pathetic, just scavenging and making threats, not exactly the awe-inspiring Spartan warrior culture which the game's lore sets them up to be, but that's okay because it showcases just how far the galaxy has moved past them being a legitimate threat. It's very clear that the enemy of the day is the Sith, who arose out of the ashes because of the Mandalorian War, and the Sith actually have some nuance both in how people view them and in how they conduct themselves. Revan and Malik are talked about as these great former Jedi, but something happened during the Mandalorian War which set them on the road which leads to galactic conquest. One contributing factor to the Sith's apparent dominance in the story's world is that the galaxy we're seeing does not, or at least no longer, wholly view the Jedi as benevolent peacekeepers. It's not a good look to spend your time meditating when there are people around you suffering unjustly, and unnecessarily would you simply snap your fingers and right whatever wrong has manifested around you. This ultra-pacifism, I think, is the core of KotOR's deconstruction of the Jedi dogma. KotOR 2 would go a lot further in regards to dissecting this franchise's morals, so much further in fact that this game's efforts in this regard are often overlooked. But this game and its story, largely through the context of the time it takes place, both force the player to question some previously held beliefs about this world. Something the RPG genre enabled was lore-heavy locations, and there's a lot of fine detailed work to be observed on every planet. Oftentimes, those fine details are used to invoke the Star Wars emotion by having us passively observe what ways there are and are not to interact with these separated groups we know about already. The Sand People are tribal, so dealing with them is naturally going to feel different from the way we deal with the Jawas or the Mandalorians. And the new races we engage with also have some of their key traits reinforced by how we engage with them. Of course, there is a universal style of presentation in terms of our main goal throughout the game and the big picture interactive stuff. Fighting, moving, and talking, but the finer details is where each planet really gets its identity. I might have said earlier that each planet was very much its own isolated experience, which was unconnected from the events of the other worlds, but don't get me wrong, there is still very much a sense of this galaxy being whole. No area feels entirely divorced from the larger world, and this is probably where the story's internal politics can take much credit. Different worlds are differently aligned, so sometimes we have an easier time doing things based on who we make friends with, and oftentimes we find ourselves studying the customs of societies to influence their social hierarchies to fit our purposes. Playing this game for any length of time really hammers home just how internally realized and consistent the worlds are. Since the interacting with the world is designed such that we need to search out information and study the ethics of each group, Bioware effectively made learning about Star Wars a fun game. A high praise to give, given our analytical lens. Every area we visit serves a narrative purpose and showcases the galaxy's expansive roster of inhabitants. Longtime followers of this channel and anyone who's played Morrowind will know that in that game, we were just expected to be familiar with the lore when it sent us out into the world. Quests were very vague in their direction, and when we got lost, we just had to read up on some Vortenfell lore. The best solution to a given problem was often different for different people because they came from different cultures and their norms were so incompatible. Every main planet in KotOR, except Yavin 4, maybe, feels like a pocket-sized slice of this Morrowind approach to immersing the player in the world, and rediscovering the style here of all places was an intensely enjoyable experience. KotOR is not as much about the journey of exploration and discovery as Morrowind was, but what this game lacks in freedom, it lacks because the planet's real purpose is to give us a landscape for our mind to wander as it examines the Star Wars mythos. This subtle, almost hands-off approach to player-world integration, and dare I say it, immersion, can likely be traced back to Morrowind and KotOR's shared ancestry in D&D. D&D DNA, I guess you could say. But it might also be apt to chalk this one up to good game design in general, as well as context. To the younger audience watching this, games of this era were a lot less concerned with being completed efficiently. It wasn't a radical idea back in the day to just let the player figure out what to do by themselves. No quest arrows needed. KotOR is of course much more directed than the average 6th generation game was, but it has respect for the player. It knows that quiet time is needed if these planets are to be remembered. The gamification of discovering odd and fantastic worlds doesn't get old. It's exciting to explore the interpersonal relationships and beliefs of the world's inhabitants. Because of this, KotOR's world is a great one to be submerged in, and a highly successful attempt at evoking the true Star Wars feels. Its numerous and well-developed inhabitants give us an incredibly wide lens through which to analyze the separated parts of the galaxy, which means we now need to talk about characters. If the planets we visit are avenues to play out the Star Wars experience, then surely the characters are here to continually ground us in that experience. It's from interacting with them that the story is unfurled, laying before our eyes and the universe takes wings. Just like every planet has us interacting with a different part of Star Wars, every one of our party members is a different inhabitant, and taking them with us to the fantastic worlds shows us how varied the worlds can be by contrasting them against the cast of characters around us. Something worth noting about KotOR's pacing is that most of the party is assembled early on. The only characters we can't meet before becoming Jedi are Jolee, Juhani, and HK-47, and Juhani we actually meet on Dantooine, where we became Jedi, so out of the 9 characters, only 2 are locked until we leave Dantooine in search of the star maps. Most of our party consists of outsiders, in one way or another. Carth Onasi and T3M4 are the exceptions, with Carth serving as a loyal Republic dude, and T3M4 filling the conventional astromech droid role of basically a loyal dog that does computers. Mission Vow is an underground player. Her Wookiee friend Zelbar is in exile. Bastila Shan has lingering doubts about the Jedi ways. Jolee Bindo is a great Jedi who lives in isolation. Juhani has fallen to the dark side, so she has lingering regret. HK-47 is a jerk, and Canderous Ordo is a still proud but degraded Mandalorian. The 9 of them together transform the Epenhawk from a tool to get us between levels into a bona fide level unto itself, into a tiny slice of everything the galaxy has to offer. From interacting with the characters on board and on the planets, we get a clear picture of the alliances and hostilities of the separate factions. When I picked up the game to replay for this video, the first thing I thought was, this UI reminds me of System Shock 2. And then I thought, crap, this UI reminds me of System Shock 2. It's overly cluttered, and that doesn't work to this game's advantage like it did for System Shock. It means players are just going to learn the bare essentials and lower the difficulty when the going gets tough. I consider this to be a big problem because I think this disincentivizes party experimentations. No character is going to excel at everything, but any given challenge can be optimally completed with the proper party. Sometimes the optimal strategy is hacking or diplomacy, so it's clear that Bioware expected players to at least experiment, but because the UI is so cluttered and the force wielders are kinda overpowered, most players will be exclusively using Bastila, Jolee, and Juhani. This is a lesson which Obsidian would not repeat in the sequel, where a lot of the times the game designed our party, at least partly, for us. In spite of the party likely going underutilized by most players, there's still diversity in these characters which makes all natural fits in different places, and the wide array of opinions each of them have about those places keeps any location from becoming idealized, keeps them grounded and believable. The conversations we have with the game's characters are functionally mandatory and optional exposition dumps masked as characterization through dialogue, which might sound uninspired, but it at least accomplishes the developer's stated goal as well as getting us up to speed on the Galaxy's big players. What was presented as relatively simple antagonisms in the movies is made much more complex in this game. The Empire, the Hutts, and the Rebels are replaced with the Republic, the Sith, the Zerka Corporation, the Mandalorians, and the Underworld. And this stuff doesn't scale in a linear fashion. The depth of the organizations are also expanded upon, with the arguable exceptions of the Underworld and the Republic. The Underworld's most notable representation is Jabba the Hutt and his cohorts, and even though KotOR explores this area in interesting ways, what with the gladiator games, the gambling, the intergroup rivalries and sabotages, I don't think there's anything in this game's Underworld that's nearly as iconic as Jabba the Hutt. The Republic's most distinguished presentation was in the prequel movies, where it served as an unruly and inefficient bureaucracy which Palpatine manipulated into giving him more and more power under the guise of efficiently fighting a war, and then he ultimately pushed it towards pure dictatorship. The Republic is almost absent as an organization which informs the world of KotOR, but it is still very much characterized as a tired body, running on fumes, since it's just come out of the Mandalorian War and is currently engaging in a war with the Sith, which is on a scale much grander than any other war of this era. They do have the Jedi helping them, but this is post-Exar Kun and post-Revan and Malak. The Galaxy has seen a lot of Jedi turned Sith start these massive conflicts, and there isn't a widespread blind faith in the Force wielders sworn to protect the Republic. That skepticism is also represented within the Jedi Order itself, with characters like Bastila and Revan expressing legitimate concerns over the way the Order conducts itself. I'm going to go over the Jedi Doctrine in more depth in a bit, but for now just know that there's a dark shadow which surrounds them. The Mandalorian's most notable representation is in everybody's favorite background character Boba Fett, but KotOR actually makes them interesting because of their content, rather than their potential. One could infer Boba Fett's character, which is what made him cool, but taking on his actions, he's the galaxy's biggest bumbling buffoon. Contrast him against Canderous Ordo and the Mandalorians we meet in KotOR, and you quickly see the greater potential of the Mandalorian story. The Mandalorians nearly conquered the entire galaxy in the lifetime of the people who we meet in-game, but because of their defeat, they are reduced to pathetic scavengers. It's not a stretch to believe that Canderous Ordo might want to return honor to his people, which leads him to have the arc he had in the second game. I said that KotOR's story was the Churchill-Roosevelt Star Wars, and if you give me that comparison, maybe you'd let me take the next logical step and refer to the Jedi-Mandalorian War as Star Wars' World War I, where an aggressive superpower emerged and tipped the scale of world powers, only to be bested when the heavy hitters finally got their act together. The Mandalorian War was what set in motion the events that led to the Jedi Civil War, what with the arrival of the Sith in Darth Revan and Darth Malak. And the Sith are richly characterized in this game, and they seem to conform to some very hostile hierarchical thinking. Whilst hierarchy is a natural expression of everything living, the Sith seem to disregard the need for good play. In life, it's okay to lose a game so long as your participation netted you a reputation for honorable conduct, or at the very least brought about some social or personal good. But for the Sith, to lose is a deep scar which one never truly heals from. If the Jedi are overly pacifistic, then the Sith are overly hostile. Unlike the Jedi, they believe that their ability to remake existence via the Force is the justification for doing so. Darth Malak is a very true embodiment of this philosophy, in fact. Revan is richly characterized throughout the game as a strategic and cunning intellectual, but Malak is a brute through and through. Others suffer his failures. He doesn't receive accolades because he's likable, but because he's powerful. The Sith's home world of Korriban is devoid of life to the extent that it might be more apt to say that it's actually just filled with death. There's nothing roaming the overworld except for the indoctrinated members of the Sith Academy. If you want to find life forms, you need to go and explore some caves or tombs, which are themselves more often than not made to invoke death. But there's actually sound philosophical reasonings given from which the behaviors of the Sith might be seen to be somewhat, I don't want to say benevolent, so reasonable. And like we did on Kashyyyk with the Wookiees, Korriban has numerous instances of us needing to adopt the Sith's philosophical framework as our own in order to resolve issues. In a way, Korriban feels like a dark Indiana Jones adventure. There's so much tomb raiding and archaeology, and then the Siths of times past emerge as ghosts and reflect on their failures and successes, but mostly failures. We see how paranoid they were in death and how they booby-trapped their graves, and the ultimate ideological conclusion of the Sith's unrestrained near-Nietzschean master morality is shown in the endless series of betrayals among the living and the dead. Malak betrayed Revan in the pursuit of greater power for himself, and like most real-life tyrants, his totalitarian worldview blinds him from the utter ineptitudes he exhibits in his conduct. Were Revan at the helm of the Sith Armada, the Sith might actually have won, but Malak is convinced of his own greatness, and so he veers much further to the dark side than Revan did. See, the Star Forge, which the entire game revolves around to some extent, is more than a giant spaceship assembler. It's possible to be a bit lost on the exact nature of the thing if you just rush through the game. I know I was when I first played the game, but you're not gonna be after watching this video. For starters, the Star Forge is old. Like, older than the Republic by many thousands of years. KotOR takes place 4,000 years before the movies, but the construction of the Star Forge took place something like 34,000 years before the movies. Another thing to note is that it is very much what its name implies, a Star Forge. It uses energy from stars to forge an endless supply of droids, ships, or anything else an army might need. But, and this is the most important thing to note about it, and once I discovered this, it retroactively turned Rakata Prime into my favorite planet. The Starforge fed off the negative energies of its original creators and became an enormous tool of dark side energy. Malak notes that the Forge is a living being which hungers, and that's very much true if we look at what happened with its creators. The Starforge began corrupting them in order to obtain the power it needed to operate itself. This led to their downfall, which led to the Forge itself becoming lost to the ages until Revan and Malak found it again. They first found the star maps, made by the same people as the Starforge, surprise surprise, and from the tiny bits of data on each one they were able to pinpoint the Forge's location. Revan wasn't aware, or at least didn't want to make use, of the Forge's ability to influence the Force, but Malak was, and that's very much what he intended to do with it before the final fight of the game. The point I made about Malak being the worst of the pair is from this distinction. There were steps which Revan thought uncrossable. On one hand, this made him better than the Jedi because it spurred him to disregard their dogma and recruit many within their ranks to end the Mandalorian War, but on the other hand, it also means that he must necessarily adopt a form of master morality in order to proceed with his goals, and in doing so, he became the Dark Lord of the Sith. Malak is not so nuanced. The guy got his hands dirty to fight the Mandalorians, and he never really got them clean again. He grew a deep-rooted hatred of the inadequacies he knew himself to possess and so sought to destroy. He didn't seduce Bastila to the dark side of the Force simply because of her battle meditation. He did it because he knew it would impact us. The Jedi Code forbids compassion, instead making serenity a virtue. This is because compassion leads to selfishness, which leads to the dark side. Bastila's turn to the dark side is what makes dissecting KotOR's conceptualization of morality so interesting, because it is possible to bring her back, but it's not done in a manner that abides by the teachings of the Jedi. You can certainly try to spout doctrine, but the only thing that works, to my knowledge, is to confess that you love her, which Jedis would forbid. But this is actually not the only example of the game's story being at odds with the conventional morality of Star Wars. The more uncomfortable example has to do with the darkness of the Jedi, which I talked about earlier. But to talk about that, we first have to talk about our main character. Our amnesiac protagonist, our silent analog in the game, is none other than Darth Revan. I think these days it's actually more rare to see a silent protagonist played straight than to see this genre convention played for some sort of plot significance, but KotOR did it early enough for it to feel fresh at the time, and looking at the game in isolation, it's a plot twist which makes a lot of sense. It's this background which gives justification for our extraordinary capabilities, and it makes our relationship with the world so much more interesting. The trial of finding the star maps gains an almost mystical aura when you realize your character has done it before. Revan's characterization pre-amnesia isn't really as that much of a villain. Sure, he did some bad things, but the guy was fighting a war. I can totally buy that he simply did what he thought he had to do to win. He twisted the natural order of things and awoke powers he didn't fully understand, but his motives were ultimately understandable. Revan's second time finding the star maps is framed within the game's morality system, which enables us to either fix the damaged order of the world, like with the cool mythical Shark of Manaan, or when we help Freyr return to power on Kashyyyk, or we can do even more damage. This twisting of the natural world is a subtle theme that runs throughout most of the game, and it and the Revan identity reveal are both important to understand before talking about the game's most daring feat, which is also the underlying darkness of the Jedi, which I've been alluding to for a while now. KotOR re-examines the moral values preached by established Star Wars media of the time by framing the Revan amnesia as a deliberate act performed by the Jedi Council. For all their talk of ethics and harmony, they could not let the opportunity to wipe Revan's mind clean to have him undo the Sith for them go. But the thing is, the good ending is canon. That being the case, the Jedi dogma didn't actually resolve the Sith threat, and for that matter, it wasn't the Jedi who stopped the Mandalorians. It wasn't them who found the Starforge, nor did they bring Bastila back to the light, or put Malak down. It was all Revan, and the game allows us to reach those conclusions without adhering to the Jedi doctrine. If you want to argue that the Jedi doctrine is sound because Revan also started the war, just remember why he did it. Revan knew that the real Sith Empire was still out there, and he knew that in order for the Republic to counter the eventual return of the true Sith, he'd need to conquer it and make it battle-ready, lest the Galaxies suffer another tragedy like the Mandalorian War, which was unnecessarily extended by the Republic and Jedi refusing to get involved at the early stages, allowing the enemy to expand their influence and consolidate their power. KotOR being a work of fiction means that drawing moral lessons from it is ridiculous, since the good can be whatever the designers wanted it to be, but regardless, the last minute or so of our talk is a much more human and complex series of moral dilemmas than anything offered to us by the movies. Not necessarily better, but certainly more complex. Also more complex is KotOR's handling of the corruption by the dark side, which is shown in Revan and Malak, because it assumes that the dark side of the Force is secondary to the corrupting forces of the psyche. Revan does not need to have been corrupted by power to have done the things he did. Malak saw the Sith throne as the ultimate prize and ultimately betrayed Revan, giving in to the dark side fully and repeating the destructive cycle of selfish indulgence which brought to their knees the Sith of old. But Revan didn't seek power for power's sake. He had the big picture in mind, and if one were to consider the Jedi's refusal to act during the Mandalorian War, then it's easy to see why Revan thought galactic conquest would be the best solution. The 19th century philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche famously wrote that When one gazes long into the abyss gazes back. And that quote seems very fitting here, and so does Nietzsche's moral ethic. With the master morality, Nietzsche argued that what is good must be that which is noble, strong-willed, and powerful, whereas slave morality saw weakness as a virtue. Whereas a master is a person who transcends hierarchy, a slave is someone displaced by it, who will, instead of resolving to ennoble him or herself, revel in their lowly status and curse that which displaced them as evil. The slave morality, being a response to master morality, will seek to elevate what slaves have and masters don't, as moral virtues, and all too often the slave will make intent the criteria by which morality is judged. The reason Nietzsche comes to mind is because Malik was undoubtedly a bad guy from both the conventional ethic and the Nietzschean ethic, as he was a rash, emotional brute and a lazy thinker who could not control himself in circumstances of great corruption, but Revan could. It took the Jedi Order mind-wiping him for that to change, and that mind-wipe destroys any credibility the Jedi have to the claim of being quote-unquote good guys. Stripping from a great man his potential and making him serve a moral purpose he himself did not agree to is an act of evil. But what are the consequences? If we play through the game as a conventionally good guy, then this mind wipe would be considered a good thing. But if we play through it as a bad guy, then it's undoubtedly an evil act, as the Jedi have in effect just swapped out Malik for a much wiser and more powerful enemy. And not only that, but also an enemy with proper moral justification to wage a war on the Jedi. So here's what KotOR has to say about Star Wars' morals. The slavish Jedi denigrate the heroic individual and make heroes out of the unacting and unfeeling monks, while the Sith's survival of the fittest destroys the greater path that can be achieved through cooperation, as the dominance hierarchy has no room for allies. Only one can be on top in the power games of the Sith. The superior path is the path which Revan took, and while this reconceptualization of Star Wars' heroism is something that would be blown completely out of the water in this game's sequel, it's worth noting that it was present here first. Much of Nietzsche's work was a scathing critique of past thinkers who, instead of criticizing and ruminating on the foundation of their ethics, would blindly follow it because it was all they knew. Someone at Bioware must have understood that furthering the potential of the Star Wars property meant examining the value structure of its ethics and pointing out how the Jedi and Sith are arbitrary classifiers which only allot the practitioners into their respective robe colors and doctrine. That might be taking things a bit too far, but that is at least the perception expressed by many of the Galaxies' inhabitants. Something the blurring of the line between the Jedi and Sith did in invoking classic Star Wars was reminding us that twists have to have consequences and they have to bring challenges on a personal level. The Darth Vader father reveal and the player is Revan reveal both place weight on the hero at their lowest point to force them to go through an extensive change, a rebirth, if you will. In the classical hero's journey, this is the belly of the whale. Of course, Darth Vader was Luke's father. Why else would there be any ethical dilemma or need to change? If Darth Vader were just an evil man through and through, then the solution to the problem would just be to kill him. Likewise, Revan must have been the player character. Why else should we care about assessing our role in the galaxy or the way we've been treated by its inhabitants? Why shouldn't we take the Jedi equals good doctrine on face value if there's nothing to contradict that? When you wrap the game up, you might find that you've grown more attached to Revan than you might have predicted you would when you started. Partly that can be attributed to spending 25 to 60 hours performing dialogue checks, and Partly it could be because this avatar has taken you through the entire gamut of what this Star Wars license has to offer. The game has more than one ending, which is to be expected from the way the game deals with morality and the fact that the player has been conditioned all throughout to expect to be able to influence events. I might not be in the majority here, but I'm not a big fan of the way this stuff was handled here. Not because the endings don't make sense or because they aren't thematically and narratively resonant, but because there's only two of them. Take out Malak and the Starforge, or take out Malak and become the one true Sith Lord. I dislike this handling of events because it betrays the morality which the game's story is clearly preaching, the thing about consequences rather than intent. Surely the Starforge could have been used to produce something beneficial to the galaxy at large, and surely Revan must still understand on some level that galactic conquest hasn't become arbitrary. After all, the Sith Empire is still very much out there. I've said this probably 10 times already, but the biggest gripe I have with this game is this divorce of the interactive language and the intended lesson. The entire story seems to be addressing the incompatibility of good and evil and them being allotted to specific ideological dogma, but for the most part the morality system doesn't reflect that. Revan's story being one of triumph is earned, because he breaks away from the rigid limitations both groups would place on him in favor of integrating with his greater self. The Sith would forbid him the expression of weakness in friends, compassion, etc., and the Jedi would forbid him from exploring the darkest depths of his own being. These limits restrict the greater potential by divorcing man from a piece of himself, forcing him to find meaning, find what's missing of himself, in the tribe he belongs to and the dogma it prescribes, rather than discovering that he might have been complete all along. KotOR really nails the fundamentals of Star Wars, and with a lot of clever writing, I feel it surpasses the original works in many ways. It's got endearing characters, a fantastically realized world, and it manages to keep adventure forever on the horizon. One thing I want to get at though, which I've saved until the end, to avoid angering the less patient viewers, is that Star Wars' greatness has never been in its spectacular depth or philosophical insightfulness. One could argue, certainly, that those things have been with the franchise since the beginning, but it's much harder to take the stance of those elements being what brought people to the franchise. The bitter reality, not really bitter, just a reality which doesn't make a saint out of the old movies, the bitter reality is that fans jumped on board with this franchise because it was flashy and it was fun. It wasn't exactly insulting to the intellect, but it was not the smart man's fantasy series, and it wasn't immensely intellectually stimulating. Those aspects of Star Wars kinda emerged in Empire Strikes Back, and they crop up again, sporadically, in Return of the Jedi, but that was after Star Wars was the biggest thing in the world, and everyone was already on board with the world and the characters. I bring this up not to denigrate the franchise, but to put into context why I think KotOR's greatest achievement is its greatest achievement. I've spent a lot of time talking about philosophy and mechanics, and while I respect what this game puts out on those fronts, they're not what I think is KotOR's greatest achievement. Star Wars has from day one been about wish fulfillment. The world is super interesting and immediately grabs the interest and imaginations of children, and since the visuals were interesting and the characters charismatic, adults could enjoy as well. KotOR takes the Star Wars fantasy and makes every facet of it interactive. Sneaking aboard the enemy base? You can do that. Pod racing? You can do that. Lightsaber fights? Yup, you can do that. Do you want to be the most powerful Jedi in the world? KotOR lets you do that. Do you want the British female supporting character to fall in love with you? Here you go. Destroy the superweapon, wipe out the sand people, fight bounty hunters, engage with the underworld, gamble with the Hutts. It's all here. This is the Star Wars wish fulfillment fantasy adventure incarnate. And there's nothing wrong with that. I need to note that because people often get snippy when they hear that the things they like aren't Shakespeare, and that's a dumb response. There's absolutely nothing wrong with wish fulfillment. It's kinda weird when you're 40 years old and dressing up in a pork costume and shitting on the new stuff in message boards because it doesn't make you feel like the old movies did when you were 8. But there is nothing wrong with wish fulfillment. Look at the #1 selling movies, songs, video games of any given year, and I promise you, it's mostly wish fulfillment. And when it's not, it's probably just some stuff your girlfriend wanted to watch. Sometimes both. And wish fulfillment is not inherently stupid, as KotOR understands. If you want to engage with the smarter aspects of Star Wars, the game has numerous avenues for you to do so, and here I want to praise KotOR for getting something right which I haven't seen many other Star Wars games get. In spite of its deconstructions, KotOR still presents a faithful conceptualization of Star Wars. This isn't just a cross-medium adaptation of the visuals and sounds we know. This game, and its sequel, contains the spirit of Star Wars. Anyone out there play The Force Unleashed? That game was all about the large-scale destruction the Force enabled and badass characters doing badass things, and that's exactly what Yoda told Luke the Force was not. It's not about how big stuff you can lift or how much damage you can deal. Power levels, stats, and upgrade trees, they're not a good way to represent the phenomena of the Force. The Force is an ethereal kind of energy which binds all life together, and since that's the case, it would make sense that the best Star Wars games aren't about physical conflict, but about engaging with characters. Yes, there's a lot of combat in this game, but it's not gratuitous, and it's probably not even made to be fun. You're mostly just clicking which type of attack to perform next and waiting for the action list to empty out before giving more commands. The Smart Man's Star Wars is about the characters juggling their roles in the world and them realizing their full potentials. It's about change and ethics and heroism. This is what the old KotOR games understood, and it's why I think these two games stand so tall above the rest of Star Wars titles. You know, it's often interesting to see what people thought a franchise was before it was as bloated as it is. Spaceballs is no longer a very accurate parody of Star Wars because so many of the jokes it makes aren't actually being made at the expense of Star Wars as we know it today. Likewise, KotOR is no longer canon to the Star Wars franchise, timestamp, and it likely won't be in its entirety again. Both because there's an opportunity to market new materials in this era which KotOR would contradict, and also because it kinda grinds against Disney's conceptualization of Star Wars' fundamentals. But I think KotOR's conceptualizations of Star Wars' fundamentals are a lot more interesting than Disney's, and in many ways, I'd argue that they far surpass those of the original Star Wars movies themselves. Blasphemy, some people might say, but to those people, I recommend reading the first issues of the Batman comic or Superman, and telling me that they more accurately or expertly present those characters than Scott Snyder's Court of Owls or Grant Morrison's All-Star Superman. Point is, franchises and characters grow, and after a while they take on a life of their own. And KotOR is a loving celebration of everything Star Wars was and could be. Because of this game's immense scope, I feel confident in recognizing KotOR as the best representation of Star Wars of its time, and I hope this video has done a good job of making that case for me. And so, we've come to the end. The footage I used was obtained mainly from Lorerunner, so I want to give him a very special mention. And not just because he's a super cool guy for letting me use the footage, but also because you people always ask me what mods I'm using and, what what graphic specs I have in my videos, even though I explicitly state every time that I don't record my own footage. If you want to know this stuff, fuck him. Anyway, I hope you've enjoyed this video, and I invite you to subscribe to the channel. Follow me on Twitter if you want to stay informed on what's next, and if you want to kick in a couple of bucks, I'll link to my Patreon page in the description box below, but you know, it's just as cool if you share this video with some of your friends who you think might enjoy it. I'm thinking about doing a video on KotOR 2 right away, but I have a tendency to make YouTube plans which don't materialize, so don't hold your breath on that video. Maybe you can even comment what game you'd like to see covered. I've been AesirAesthetics. Thanks for watching, and take care.